Welcome to the debate. I want you to picture this scenario because, well, it actually happens every single day all over the world. You have a massive container ship. We're talking about a vessel that is longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall, and it's approaching a foreign port. It is carrying, $1 billion in cargo, chemicals, maybe fuel. A small boat pulls alongside in choppy waves, a rope ladder drops down, and a single figure climbs up the side. That is the maritime pilot. They walk onto the bridge, they shake hands with the captain, and then who is actually in charge?
Yeah, it sounds like such a simple, almost administrative question of chain of command when you frame it like that. But the answer determines whether that billion-dollar ship actually docks safely or ends up on the rocks, causing a generational environmental catastrophe. It is a tension that exists on the bridge of literally every commercial vessel entering every port in the world.
Exactly. We're navigating the pretty treacherous waters of command versus conduct today. The central question is really this. When that pilot boards, does the master, the captain, retain absolute authority? Or does the pilot, who obviously knows the local waters, effectively take over? So to kick this off, I'm going to be taking the position of unified command. My argument is that the legal reality, and I mean the hard international maritime law, dictates that the master retains absolute authority. The pilot, while undeniably crucial, is effectively a specialized technical advisor. To suggest otherwise creates a really dangerous vacuum where nobody knows who is ultimately responsible.
Right, and I'm going to push back against that immediately. I will be arguing for the principle of operational conduct. The whole idea of the pilot as merely an advisor is, frankly, a legal fiction. It's a fiction that collapses the moment you are in a narrow channel with a heavy crosswind. In the real world, the pilot acts as a representative of the port state. They exercise independent judgment that absolutely must supersede the master's commercial interests to keep the harbor safe.
Okay, well, let's start with the baseline, because I think there is a lot of confusion here, even among industry professionals. The concept of command is legally indivisible. You simply cannot have two captains on one ship. The International Maritime Organization, the IMO, and the SOLAS Conventions, which stands for Safety of Life at Sea, basically the Bible of maritime safety, they are totally explicit on this. Resolution A.960 states clearly, unequivocally, that the master, not the pilot, is at all times in command of the ship.
I don't dispute the text. I've read the resolutions. But I strongly dispute the application here. You are talking about command, but I am talking about the Conn.
Oh, I am so glad you brought that up, because the Conn is one of those terms that gets thrown around loosely in movies and by people who don't actually understand modern merchant shipping. It is a naval term. It's mostly used in warships, referring to the specific officer directing the movement of the ship, conning the vessel. But in merchant shipping, this concept doesn't legally exist in the same way. When a pilot boards and says, starboard 20, legally, that is advice. The master permits that order to be executed by the helmsman. The master never hands over their authority. They only authorize the execution of specific orders.
See, that right there is exactly what I mean by legal fiction. It sounds incredibly pristine in a law library, but on the bridge of a supertanker doing 10 knots in a narrow dredged channel, it is practically nonsense. I'm looking at the work of Captain George A. Quick from the International Maritime Pilots Association, IMPA. He argues, and I think he is entirely right, that if a pilot were merely an advisor, navigation would be physically impossible.
Impossible? How so? If the master is competent, why is advice impossible to follow?
Because of the time factor. There is simply no time to debate every single rudder command. It's a pilot says starboard 20 to avoid a mudbank that, say, shifted yesterday and isn't on the ship's electronic chart yet, and the captain has to mentally process that, agree to it, evaluate it against his own data, and then order the helmsman, you have already hit the mudbank. The Royal Commission on Pilotage in Canada actually put it perfectly. They wrote, "The first course a ship is committed to is frequently the last. The pilot is making instant tactical decisions. They are navigating, not suggesting. That is conduct, and it is distinct from command."
I understand the distinction you're trying to draw between conduct, meaning the moment-to-moment maneuvering, and command. But splitting those hairs is exactly where the real-world danger lies. You argue that conduct implies the pilot is in charge of the maneuver. I am telling you, based on the accident data, that this specific mindset leads to crew passivity and ultimately disaster.
I would argue clarity leads to decisive action. How does recognizing the pilot's conduct lead to disaster?
Because if the crew believes the pilot has conduct, that the pilot is essentially the god of the bridge for that 1-hour transit, they stop checking his math. Look at the analysis in the Mars report and the Sheezy Maritime Journal regarding a major passenger vessel grounding. In that specific incident, the pilot ordered a rate of turn that was clearly mathematically unsafe. There were successive increases from 5 degrees to 20 degrees, eventually 30 degrees. The vessel was swinging way off track.
Right, and where was the master? Why didn't he step in?
That is exactly my point. The bridge team stayed completely silent. And why did they stay silent? Because they bought into your theory. They believed the pilot had total conduct, so they stopped challenging his errors. The official report explicitly identifies this as suboptimal bridge resource management, or BRM. When the crew believes the pilot is a sovereign commander rather than an advisor they are legally required to monitor, they just mentally check out.
But that sounds like a massive failure of the crew's training, not a failure of the pilotage system itself. You cannot blame the pilot's necessary authority for the crew's laziness.
It is absolutely a failure of the system if the system itself encourages the crew to abdicate their responsibility. Captain Raghu Sharma analyzes this brilliantly in an article called The DeepDraft. He points out that the master has the overriding authority to displace the pilot at any time. If the pilot is in charge as you claim, why is the master legally duty-bound to intervene if the pilot is incompetent? You can't have it both ways. You cannot say, I'm in charge when the docking goes right and the master should have stopped me when you hit the pier.
Okay, that is a compelling argument regarding the psychological mindset of the crew. I will grant you that. But have you considered why intervention is the exception and not the rule? Captain Quick notes that the master is very often a complete stranger to local waters. If we legally treat the pilot merely as an advisor, an employee providing a suggestion, we invite intense commercial pressure into the navigational equation.
Commercial pressure is a totally separate issue from navigational authority.
I disagree entirely. I think it is the exact same issue. Think about it. If a master feels they can easily overrule a pilot simply because the pilot is just an advisor, they will do so to meet a shipping schedule. They'll say, don't take the long way around the anchorage, pilot. We are late. Or don't order 2 tugs for this docking, pilot. They are too expensive. Just use 1. If the pilot has statutory conduct, they are insulated from that. They can say, no, Captain, I am conducting this vessel on behalf of the port state, and we are doing this safely, regardless of your charter party schedule. That authority protects the local environment. The advisor label is dangerous because it encourages the master to gamble with safety for the sake of economics.
And that really depends on your definition of fairness versus macroeconomic reality.
Let's look at the data. I'm citing a detailed dissertation by Jae-Koon Lim regarding the South Korean pilotage system. In South Korea, pilots face criminal, administrative, and full civil liability for their actions. Look at the famous Woo-san case. The pilot was speeding, hit a pier, caused a massive, catastrophic oil spill, and caused $90 million in damages. The pilot was jailed.
A tragedy, certainly, and a terrifying precedent for any maritime professional.
But fair, right? If the pilot is truly conducting the ship on behalf of the state, as you forcefully argue, they should be fully liable for their negligence just like a doctor or a civil engineer. If a surgeon botches a heart procedure, they get sued for malpractice. Yet in the UK under the Pilotage Act of 1987, and in Canada, a pilot's liability is capped at absurdly low amounts. We're talking often $1,000, or just the cost of the pilotage fee itself. It leaves the victim of the crash uncompensated unless the shipowner's insurance pays out. You seem to want supreme authority without any of the accountability.
I come at it from a completely different angle. It is not about avoiding accountability. It's about the economic reality of risk distribution. The ship owner has the deep pockets. They have the massive hull and machinery insurance policies. They have the P&I clubs, the protection and indemnity insurance. The individual pilot is a shallow pocket.
So just because the pilot is poor relative to a massive global shipping conglomerate, they shouldn't be responsible for their own mistakes? That feels like a massive moral hazard just waiting to happen.
It is not about protecting the individual pilot's bank account. It is about system stability. If independent pilots had to carry personal insurance policies large enough to cover a $1 billion oil spill or a $90 million pier crash, pilotage fees would skyrocket astronomically. It would make shipping economically unviable for smaller ports. World trade relies on efficient, affordable pilotage. The Brussels Convention of 1910, which is foundational maritime law, established that liability attaches to the vessel even under compulsory pilotage, precisely because the service benefits the vessel and its cargo.
But doesn't that inherently create a moral hazard? If I know I am not paying to fix the Ferrari if I crash it, I might drive the Ferrari a little faster.
Does it? Look at the Korean model you just cited. LIM's research shows that unlimited liability actually causes defensive piloting. If I know I can be thrown in a foreign jail and bankrupted for a minor miscalculation, I am going to refuse to board a ship in even marginally bad weather. I am going to demand 4 expensive tugboats when one would easily do the job. I'm going to wait for the tide to be absolutely 100% perfect before I even think about moving.
Defensive piloting sounds an awful lot like safe piloting to me. Why is taking extra precautions a bad thing?
There is cautious and then there is paralyzed. If a major port shuts down every single time the wind blows 15 knots because the pilots are terrified of a civil lawsuit, the global supply chain literally collapses. Limitation of liability isn't a loophole to protect the pilot's wallet. It's a structural necessity to maintain the flow of commerce. The port needs these ships to move.
I see your point on the macroeconomics of commerce, but the current system creates incredible friction on the bridge. The Britannia P&I Club released a major report analyzing 1,046 incidents over 20 years involving pilots. The cost? $1.82 billion. That is almost $2 billion coming straight out of the ship owners' pockets for errors often made by a pilot they were legally forced to employ by local law. That creates a lot of bad blood before the pilot even steps off the ladder. And that cost is absorbed into the global cost of shipping goods. It is an efficient system of distributing loss. It spreads the risk across the entire multi-trillion-dollar industry rather than destroying one individual pilot's life for a split-second error. But it fosters resentment, and more importantly, it breaks down the bridge team dynamic we were talking about earlier. This brings us back to the human element. We talked about BRM. There is a required ritual called the Master Pilot Exchange, or MPX. The pilot comes aboard, they look at the charts together, they discuss the passage plan. But because of this weird, ambiguous authority dynamic, the MPX very often becomes a simple tick box exercise. The master feels helpless because he legally has to take the pilot, and the pilot feels untouchable because of his liability cap.
I agree that a bad MPX is a recipe for disaster. If they aren't talking to each other, they aren't navigating safely.
The Britannia report highlights this failure explicitly. They suggest the industry needs to aggressively implement models like PACE to fix this communication breakdown.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with aviation or maritime bridge resource training, break down PACE.
Gladly. It stands for Probe, Alert, Challenge, Emergency. It is a graded assertiveness tool. A junior officer starts by probing. They might say, "Pilot, I see we are slightly off track." It's a gentle question. If there's no response or a dismissive response, they escalate to alert. "Pilot, our speed is too high for this turn." That is a statement of objective fact. Then, challenge. "Pilot, you need to slow down the vessel right now." That is a strong suggestion bordering on an order. Finally, emergency. The master verbally takes control of the vessel.
It is a great model. It structures the intervention so it doesn't feel like a mutiny every time someone has a question.
Right, but here is the critical catch. The legal reality that the master is master must be rigidly reinforced to empower the crew to actually use those models. If a 25-year-old junior officer thinks the 50-year-old local pilot is a god with statutory conduct, they will never use PACE. They won't even probe. They will stay silent until the ship hits the rocks. We must reinforce unified command to give the crew the psychological confidence to speak up.
That is an interesting point. Though I would frame the crew's hesitation a bit differently. The crew absolutely should challenge errors, but we have to be realistic about the knowledge gap here. The IMPA guidance explicitly notes that the master is often a stranger to the local waters. The pilot brings specialized knowledge the master simply cannot possess. Highly localized currents, shifting sandbanks, specific berth peculiarities, how the local tugs operate.
Having knowledge is not the same as having command. I can hire a Sherpa to guide me up Mount Everest. He knows the mountain better than anyone, but I ultimately decide if we push for the summit or turn back.
But the knowledge dictates the action. If the master tries to co-pilot or second-guess every single local nuance based on a generic electronic chart, you get total confusion on the bridge. I want to quote Dr. Lushington from the famous Admiralty case, the Peerless, in 1860. I know it's an old case, but the logic holds perfectly today. A divided authority is the parent of all confusion. If the master is constantly asserting his command by overriding the pilot's tactical conduct, you get chaos. The helmsman won't know whose orders to follow.
Divided authority is the parent of all confusion. I actually agree entirely with the quote, but I apply it differently. The confusion comes from the pilot acting as if they have command. If everyone on that bridge understood the pilot is an advisor, a highly skilled, highly paid, absolutely indispensable advisor, but an advisor nonetheless, the confusion vanishes. The master takes the advice, orders the helm, and retains the mental burden of the ship's safety.
And while the master is mentally processing whether to accept that advice, checking his screens, the ship has traveled 2 cables and completely missed the turn. You keep ignoring the time lag in ship handling.
That is a complete caricature of the process. A good master-pilot exchange, as detailed in the very IMPA guidance you cite, sets the shared mental model before the turn even approaches. If they agree on the plan beforehand, the master isn't processing a new concept in real time. He is just monitoring the execution of the agreed-upon plan.
We agree on the importance of the MPX. But let's look at the Britannia case studies again. In Case Study 3, a large tanker hit a jetty because the pilot ordered an engine movement too late. The master intervened, but he intervened too late. The report says the suboptimal BRM was the root cause. But why was it suboptimal? Because the master hesitated. Why did he hesitate? Because he was properly deferring to the pilot's superior local expertise. If we strip the pilot of authority and call him a servant of the ship, you might think that empowers the master. But in reality, it just forces the master to micromanage a specialist, which he isn't qualified to do.
It forces the master to take responsibility, which is exactly what the law requires of him.
Responsibility, yes. But let's talk about the pilot's independence again. In the Britannia report, they mention that pilot error caused or contributed to over 1,000 incidents.
Sure.
But how many incidents were prevented by a pilot refusing a ship owner's dangerous request? We don't have stats for that because accident avoided doesn't make the evening news. If you make the pilot a mere borrowed servant of the ship, legally subservient to the master in every single way, you completely remove the port state's only independent check on that vessel.
The port state has plenty of other checks. They have vessel traffic services, VTS. They have port state control inspections. The pilot is on the bridge to assist the navigation, not to act as a maritime police officer watching the master.
They do both. That is the duality of the role. And yes, that duality is uncomfortable.
It's more than uncomfortable. It is legally incoherent. You want the pilot to be a policeman when it suits the state's interests, and a navigator when it suits the ship's movement, but liable to absolutely no one when things go wrong and the ship hits a bridge.
I want the pilot to be able to exercise professional, safety-critical judgment without fear of personal bankruptcy or being overruled by a captain who is terrified of getting fired by his company for being an hour late.
Let's circle back to the liability issue because it really sticks in the craw of the industry. You mentioned the deep pockets of the ship owner earlier. But the Woo Yu-song case in Korea shows us that when full civil liability is applied to the pilot, it serves as a massive deterrent against recklessness. The argument that it stops trade is purely speculative. The argument that it enforces discipline is evident in the data.
It is not speculative. Lim's dissertation explicitly analyzes the need for a limitation system in Korea precisely because of the negative effects of that unlimited liability. It creates a culture of fear on the water. Do you want a terrified pilot on your bridge?
Someone who is thinking about their mortgage rather than the rudder angle?
I want a pilot who is as financially and morally invested in the safety of the ship as the master is. If the pilot knows, hey, it's just the ship owner's P&I insurance, I'll only lose my $1,000 limit, where's the skin in the game?
The skin in the game is their license, their professional reputation, and frankly, their physical safety. They are standing on the ship too. If it sinks, they swim. That is sufficient motivation. We do not need to add multi-million-dollar financial ruin to the equation to make a pilot care about his job.
And yet we see 1,046 incidents in the Britannia report. Clearly, the current motivation structure isn't perfect.
Perfection is not the standard. Safety is. And generally, global pilotage is incredibly safe given the sheer volume of maritime traffic. The exceptions, like the grounding in the Mars report you brought up, usually come down to communication failures between two humans, not the legal structure of maritime liability.
But the communication failure stems directly from the legal ambiguity. That is my entire point today. If the crew knows we are paying this person to advise us, but we are liable if he messes up, they watch him like a hawk. If they think he has the conduct, he represents the state, they relax and look out the window.
I think we are looking at the exact same problem on the bridge and seeing opposite solutions. You see the pilot's authority as a usurpation that causes crew complacency. I see the pilot's authority as a necessary shield that prevents commercial recklessness from the ship owner.
We certainly are, and I think that friction is what makes this topic so fascinating. As we wrap up today, I want to summarize the position of unified command. The legal texts, SOLAS, IMO Resolution A.960, they are not suggestions. They are the law. They state the master is in command. The concept of the Conn in merchant shipping is a dangerous illusion. It creates a gray zone where bridge crews hesitate to challenge clear errors. While the pilot provides essential local knowledge, the legal and moral responsibility rests squarely with the master. We must strip away the myth of the pilot's independent command to ensure that the bridge team remains alert, active, and ready to intervene. Ambiguous authority structures lead to silence on the bridge and disaster on the rocks.
And I maintain that the pilot is the vital guardian of the public interest. The advisor label is a legal fiction that creates danger by inviting commercial interference in safety-critical decisions. The pilot must have conduct, the tactical control of the vessel to navigate effectively in tight quarters. Furthermore, liability caps are not some unfair loophole. They are a necessary economic structure to keep world trade moving and to protect the pilot's independent judgment. If we treat pilots as mere servants of the shipowner, we lose the only independent safety check that exists on board that vessel.
It is a really complex relationship. It's often described in the industry as a forced marriage.
It really is. The master cannot choose the pilot, and the pilot cannot choose the ship. They are stuck with each other for that transit, often meeting for the very first time just minutes before the most dangerous part of the voyage begins.
And like any forced marriage, it relies far more on mutual professional respect and clear communication, that master-pilot exchange, than it does on rigid legal definitions.
We can definitely agree on that. While the master holds the command, the safety of the voyage very often relies on trusting the pilot's conduct,
leaving the listener to decide where the line should be drawn when things go wrong.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining the debate.